So the world has been watching in horror, first the events of October 7th when Hamas terrorists attacked Israeli civilians, citizens, elderly, women, children, took a large number of them hostage. And then subsequently, there is growing concern about this humanitarian catastrophe which is about to unleash itself because Israel is preparing for a massive ground operation. The United Nations has warned that asking more than 1 million people to evacuate from North Gaza with virtually just 24 hours notice is inviting a humanitarian catastrophe. What led to this, and more importantly, where is this story headed? I'm now joined by Mr. Daniel Levy. He's a former Israeli negotiator for peace. He was part of the negotiation process for the Oslo Accords back in the 1990s. Thank you very much, Mr. Levy, for speaking with us here on CNN News 18.
Thank you, Zahar.
Let me start off by asking you, first things first, the events of October 7th, when Hamas terrorists in large numbers across different locations, more than 24 locations almost, attacked Israeli civilians, many of them the most vulnerable, whether it's elderly or babies. Why do you think that was the case? We haven't seen anything quite of this magnitude in the last decade and a half that Hamas has been active.
Actually, never. We've never seen anything of this magnitude. And look, on the Israeli side, there is clearly a monumental failure of intelligence, of deterrence, of initial military response. Obviously, Israel has a certain reputation, right? Not considered to be an intelligence or a military minnow. It's prided itself on that reputation. So there will be a very serious investigation the morning after. And Prime Minister Netanyahu is probably not very keen to reach the morning after for that very reason. Now, if you're asking from the side of Hamas, how did this happen? There's some suggestions that Hamas was itself somewhat taken aback by the number of people it managed to get through multiple border openings that it achieved, and that perhaps there were irregulars. In other words, Palestinians in Gaza, suddenly the gate opens, they come across, were they armed, were they given arms? I think there's a lot of unanswered questions there. There was, of course, a horrific and tragic outcome to that attack. And as you say, we're now witnessing the second wave, which is you have a war crime, and now we seem to be in the throes of another war crime.
I'll get to that in just a second, but I want to know, whenever, countries and countries that are democracies have faced attacks on their civilians. We saw this with 9/11 in the United States. We saw this here in this country, in India, with the 26/11 attacks. And now with Israel, with these mass number of civilians, over 1,000 civilians being killed in Israel. It's never happened in its history. How are democratic countries, countries that believe in the rule of law and that are expected to operate within the laws that govern the Comity of Nations, how are they expected to respond? Because the terrorists on the other side, by attacking civilians, are not exactly playing by established rules, are they?
Well, I think it's a very important point. I think in this case, you have to bear in mind that Israel, of course, is a democracy for those inside what it defines as its system, but it imposes a non-democratic control on the Palestinians. So you have this kind of system where Israel is not, so someone once defined it as Israel is a democracy for its Jewish citizens and a Jewish state for the Arabs. So it doesn't really function as a democracy. And unfortunately, of course, Israel is in violation of international law every day with its illegal actions in the occupied territories, including the illegal settlements. That's why there is a case before the International Criminal Court right now under consideration in terms of the actions that Israel has conducted in the past and the ongoing role that Israel plays vis-a-vis the Palestinians. So I think your starting point is you have already structural violence embedded in the system of Israel's control over the Palestinians, which isn't to excuse the actions of Hamas, but it's not quite this idea of a democracy facing that. I think the reaction when faced with the events of October 7th is precisely how do you operate within the rules? And I think that what we've seen is that by operating outside of those rules, you do not bring yourself more security. I won't speak to the situation in your own country, but I will speak to, I think, the shortcomings of America's response to 9/11, which did not make America secure. Of course, unlike Israel and India, America went overseas to hunt its demons, which is very different.
I do want to ask you now about the Israeli response. Obviously, over the last 10 days, we've seen airstrikes in over 2,000 different locations. Israel saying that these are targeted attacks of the Hamas leadership, political and military. But it's also saying, and it's mobilized, ground troops in large numbers for a possible ground invasion. It looks imminent. And the justification from the Israeli side is when you have an enemy that uses civilians as shields, where these terrorists are hidden, behind civilians, how else do you flush out the terrorists without a ground operation? That's the justification from the Israeli side. Do you buy that or do you not buy that?
Well, first of all, let's understand, at the moment that we're talking, it's unclear exactly when. The question of if seems to have been answered, but the question of when there will be a ground invasion is unclear. But what there has been is a reaction which, and I think this is why people are questioning the reaction so increasingly and quite severely. It's very hard to claim that the reaction has been targeting militants, because the reaction has been to cut water, fuel, electricity, medical, humanitarian supplies to the entire civilian population of Gaza. That's 2 million people. That's not 2 million plus people. That's not going after the militants. The blanket bombing where we've seen 2,800 plus Palestinians killed, including 700 plus children, that's not targeting militants. So I think targeting militants is one thing, but targeting an entire civilian population, that's when you get into you're very far down the road towards war crimes, disproportionality, a failure to distinguish between combatants and civilians. Now, the question of embeddedness in a civilian population is, of course, a much broader one, and it brings to the question of what is Hamas, what is the nature of Palestinian life under Israeli occupation, why is the Palestinian Authority, that is the party, the Fatah, the PLO, that made the agreement with Israel, why has it lost public support? Why is it so reviled by most Palestinians? Not because they love Hamas and its actions, but because they have seen that politically the side that made the peace deals failed to deliver, because all sides failed to live up to their commitments, but especially Israel deepened its occupation. There's no Palestinian state. So it's a question of where Palestinian society is at, living this way of having its statehood and its freedoms denied for so long, which causes this situation in the civilian population also. So
that brings us to the next question, which is, yes, Israel is going in. They've done airstrikes. Like I said, the ground operation looks imminent. But let's say the objective of this entire Operation Iron Swords, as it's called, is to debilitate Hamas. It's to ensure that Hamas cannot launch the kind of attacks that it did on Israeli citizens last weekend. What happens after that? And if at all, A, can Israel achieve that objective? Is it possible for Israel to achieve that objective? And B, if they do, what then comes after Hamas? That's also a question that needs to be asked.
That's a very good question, Zaka. I appreciate you asking it. I think the question of what happens after is perhaps not so different to the question of how did we get to where we were before, which is, can you have an opening to a politics, to a political, diplomatic, non-violent process that gives Palestinians a reasonable expectation that they cannot live under occupation forever? And so I think if there were a narrative saying, look, this is about ending a militant insurgency that has cause great pain to our civilians, so that we can get to a place of political conflict resolution, then that would be a very interesting position to be in. If we were in that position, we probably would not have seen the horrors that we saw already. I think it's the refusal on the Israeli part to engage in the politics which makes this even more complicated. And the idea is that the morning after is somehow more secure. History suggests that without politics, we're still going to be in a place of insecurity. And I fear that not only will the next days and weeks and maybe longer be devastating for Palestinians, but it will also not bring security for Israelis, because there's not the political follow-up, there's not the addressing of the root causes.